Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. This is Ed Salzberg, and I'm the Executive Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum. And I welcome you to what I think is our 380th webinar, Sustainability Webinar. And we're working with Ceres, a great organization, and I hope you go to the Ceres website and see what they do that in helping to lead the transition to a clean, equitable, sustainable future. To the SSF subscribers, I just encourage you to become part of the Ceres community. It's just a very important organization. We're going to be talking about managing climate risks and promoting sustainability supply chains, and this is based around a new FAR rule that Ceres has been working on to try to get implemented. Very important rule for government contractors. I'm pleased to be working with Stephen Rothstein, who is the Managing Director of Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. Stephen has an incredible background as a founder of nonprofits, activist groups, and working in government agencies. It's just a pleasure to work with you, Stephen. So thank you for being the intellectual leader here and helping and putting this together. The federal government of the United States purchasing really drives commercial purchasing. What the government buys, commercial companies really have to get behind. And the biggest purchaser of goods and services is the Department of Defense. And we're just really fortunate to have three former top sustainability officials to be talking about this new rule and the implications for the rule. Miranda Ballantyne has a long career supporting federal and commercial organizations. She was the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, former director of sustainability, renewable energy, and sustainable facilities at Walmart. And most importantly for this webinar, she was the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations and Environment, where she oversaw a $9 billion budget here and overseas. Richard Kidd has been pivotal in driving environmental stewardship and energy resilience at various agencies, including as a top sustainability official in the Department of the Army. He was also the head of the Federal Energy Management Program. He was at the White House, but his last position is the one that I think is most important for this webinar. He last served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment and Energy Security, and he's just been critical in the greenhouse gas emissions plans that the Department of Defense has done. And then finally, Carla Perry is an Executive Vice President of the Spectrum Group. She specializes in energy, environment, and national security. She practiced law and worked at the US EPA in the Office of Global Climate Change. But her most important contribution here is her position as the former Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environment and Security. And that was the top DoD Sustainability Officer position at that time. And so with that, I just welcome you everyone to the webinar, and I thank the panelists. And let me now turn this over to Stephen, who will provide an overview of what we're doing, and then each of the panelists will speak, then we'll do a moderated discussion and audience Q&A, and then we'll end the session. So Stephen, let me turn this over to you, and the session is yours. If everyone would turn their cameras off, and we'll have Stephen on to lead us forward.
Right, Ed, first, thank you, and thank everyone in the audience for joining. And maybe we just put the slides back up, Ed.
Sorry.
And thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it. And Ed, the work that you do and the Security and Sustainability Forum plays such a critical role that we really appreciate that. And again, as Ed said, we hope to have lots of questions. We've already gotten many from folks that we'll be using some, but if there's additional questions, you can put them in the control panel. I hope that you do that throughout the session. Next slide, please. As Ed said, I can't think of three people individually, never mind collectively, that have more knowledge there on this issue. So we are humbled that Miranda, Carla, and Richard can join, and I'm going to be as brief as I can. I also just want to recognize all the Ceres staff that have worked on this, and John Kostiak, who is really the he's really the brains behind all this. So appreciate John's effort. Next slide, please. Ceres is a nonprofit. We're in our 35th year. We have an investor network. Our investors about $45 trillion of assets under management. We work with some big companies, work with policy, both in Washington, in various states, and around the world. We're very active in regulatory issues from the SEC and many other things. And again, I welcome a chance to chat with you offline. If you're not involved with Ceres, you'd like to be involved. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about here? As Ed briefly mentioned, the federal government is the largest purchaser of goods and services of anyone in the world, about $750 billion a year. And it's enormous. And under the current administration, we give them great credit. They've proposed 2 rules. Today, we're really focusing on the supplier climate risk disclosure rule that the draft was introduced. They've received comments, and they're going through their final evaluation right now. And then another rule that was just finalized a few weeks ago was the Sustainable Products Procurement Rule. That's also very important. We're not going to spend much time today on it, but again, if there are questions, let us know. We think the combination of these are really great for taxpayers, save taxpayers dollars, good for climate, and good for our children and grandchildren. Next slide, please. What kind of risks are they? So the companies are very diverse and the risks are very diverse, but they come in a few broad categories. First, relate to physical risks, fires, floods, tornadoes, etc. And we all know what's happening there, but I'll just give you one quick statistic that NOAA said in the 1980s, the United States had $1 billion storm every 4 months. 1980s, 4 months. Last year, it was greater than, it was between every 2 and 3 weeks. So we're seeing a lot more of these. The costs are larger, they're lasting longer, and that's affecting companies, suppliers, things like that. One of the examples of physical risk is what's happening in the Panama Canal, because the drought there's about a 40% reduction in the number of ships that are going through it. So if you're a federal supplier and your part or your widget is on a container, it may be delayed. So it's important to understand that. Second is about the transition to the decarbonized economy. If you're a spark plug company today, or there's hundreds and hundreds of different industries, some that are growing and are, blades for windmills and solar and carbon capture and many other technologies, and others like a spark plug that maybe we're not going to use as many as we build more EVs. So understanding how the economy is changing is important. It's very important that with only the largest companies, we're just talking about climate disclosure here, not change in practices, just climate disclosure, so that taxpayers and federal officials and others can understand. And then the third is the systemic risk due to the functioning of programs. I mean, the federal government is unfortunately many times the funder of last resort, whether it be on pandemic or flood risks or many other nature-based crises. And so understanding what those risks are and what they will be in the future help us as a taxpayer perspective. Next slide, please. So what does this rule say? The proposed rule. First is, I give the FAR Council, the federal government, great credit for their thoughtfulness and how they put it together. 98% of the suppliers, 98% will have no impact on this. This rule will have no impact on them. So it's really the largest suppliers. These are companies, a lot of them are public, a lot of them are already doing disclosure because of the requirements of either an agency in the United States or around the world. And so the 1% of the suppliers, those that sell between $7.5 and $50 million a year, they will disclose scope 1, scope 2. Scope 1 are the emissions to produce their product or service. Scope 2 is the energy they have to purchase to keep those facilities going. So that's 1%. The top 0.3%. So very, very, very small number. It's only those who are selling $50 million or more. They have to also do scope 3, so scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 3 is their supply chain, and do a climate risk assessment and to set targets. So to say, here's where their company is now, where do they want to be by 2030, by 2035, by 2040, and to get to a net zero plan. The government isn't telling them how to do that. It's just outlining that they should have a plan, but what their plan is completely up to them. Next slide, but again, it's only the largest suppliers we're talking. Next slide, please. So we want to get into the meat of this, but again, we have such experts. We want you to get involved. They're in the final stages of considering this. We will. We hope that you will. We'll send this out afterwards with the links. But we hope that you'll, if you have questions, reach out to myself or my colleague John Kostiak, whose emails are here, or write to the government. And we have a sample letter on this. If you go to this series.org/accelerator/procurement, a sample letter for you to consider sending. So with that, with deep thanks to all of you, we'll take down the slides, and I'll turn this over to Miranda for her kind of introductory comments, and then she'll introduce our other two distinguished speakers. And with that, Miranda, thank you for all you're doing and for being here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's just a delight to be here. And of course, special thank you to Ed from the Security and Sustainability Forum and Steve from Ceres and my distinguished co-discussants, Richard and Carla, who I will pass it to in just a moment. Just a delight to be here. A little bit more about me. I have spent the majority of the last 25 years working in the realm of large energy customers, in fact, the largest. I was the head of the global strategy team for Walmart's sustainable facilities and renewable energy program for many years, and then had the opportunity, as Ed mentioned when he was introducing me, to come into the Pentagon as a political appointee and support the United States Air Force in its endeavors around clean energy, sustainability, as well as all things related to infrastructure. So it's just a delight to be here. Just to sort of re-ground folks, reminders, we'll probably be talking scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 a lot, and we are presuming most of you as participants in today are going to understand what that means, but just a quick reminder. As Steve said, scope 1 is really the emissions that a facility itself or a vehicle itself emits directly. So you can think if you have a natural gas plant on site, or if you're burning fuel in a car or burning coal on site, which when I was in the Air Force and still today, we do still have some coal-fired power plants on site. Scope 2 is the purchased electricity that is required to run a facility. And for many organizations, scope 2 is the largest piece of the footprint, and scope 3 is supply chain up or down. And that really is a big piece of what we're discussing today. The importance of an organization understanding the impacts of its supply chain, really, I can't understate it. I was part of the team at Walmart that first began asking its suppliers to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and scope 2. And we did that at Walmart because this threat and opportunity, frankly, of climate change is so substantial that we felt if we were looking at the opportunities and threats of the impact of climate change on our business, that it was important our suppliers were looking at it as well and adapting their businesses to plan for the changing weather patterns, plan for changing growing conditions, plan for a changing regulatory environment. And the same is true for the federal government, who, as Steve rightly noted, is the largest procurer of things, whether you're talking about fighter jets or staples and office paper. The federal government buys a lot of things. And the federal government and the Department of Defense in particular are deeply examining the impacts, both the upside opportunities and the downside risks that a changing climate will present to the Department of Defense mission. And Richard will talk quite a lot more about this, I'm sure. At the Air Force, we were looking very closely at shifts in severe weather, how that was going to impact our installations, how that was going to impact our ability to fly, fight, and win, as we say in the Air Force. We were looking at human conflict, how changes in weather were going to exacerbate human conflict in some parts of the world. And we felt, and the new FAR rules really get to the heart of the fact that business as usual, using a rear view mirror of how the weather and the climate acted for the last 100, 200, 500 years, was not going to give us a good picture going forward. And for those reasons, it's really important that the supply chain is also examining those risks. I think I'll pause there because I want to leave plenty of opportunity for questions, and I'm going to pass it to my dear friend and colleague, Richard Kidd, who has really probably done more in this space in the department across all the different agencies and at the Office of the Secretary level. With no further ado, Richard, take it away.
Hi, Miranda. Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. Ed and Stephen, thank you for organizing it. And Carla, thanks for spending some time here on the panel and everybody for joining. So as Miranda said, I've been a long-time active participant in federal sustainability efforts, joining the Department of Energy back in 2007, where I worked with the Federal Energy Management Program, where we helped to write the first sustainability executive order and the first greenhouse gas accounting guide for federal officials and agencies. And moved around a bit, worked in the Army, worked at the White House on permitting, and then most recently in the Department of Defense, where I was responsible for the energy and environment portfolio, which included major portions of greenhouse gas adaptation and mitigation activities. We're not talking much about mitigation today, but just to be clear that for the Department of Defense, the mitigation activities really go through the lens of resilience. How can the Department of Defense ensure resilient operations? And likewise, the climate adaptation efforts also had a strong resilience component. So I'd like to, if you haven't read it, I'd like to direct everyone's attention to the Climate Adaptation Plan, which was a requirement under Executive Order 14008, but the Department of Defense sort of led the way with a very comprehensive adaptation plan. Sorry, perfect timing. I didn't turn my phone off. How many thousands of hours of these things have we done? Anyway, so the Climate Adaptation Plan took a very expansive approach to adaptation. It had its end state was to ensure the Department of Defense could continue to operate under all future climate conditions. And it had 5 lines of effort. The first was data-driven decision-making, sort of to embed climate change considerations into the decisions across the department. And Miranda alluded to that earlier, is that you must have data across the decisions that you're making. And you can't just have a boutique climate team, but you really have to have climate considerations across all the key decision activities. The next was in terms of equipment and people. So the Department of Defense is primarily a people organization. Young soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and some Guardians are the most important asset in the Department of Defense. So how is climate change going to affect them, and how do we need to adapt them as well as the equipment that we buy? Third is infrastructure, which was normally what most folks think of in terms of climate adaptation is infrastructure resilience. Importantly for this conversation, the fourth line of effort was supply chain and supply chain resilience. And then finally, the fifth was partnerships and working with key partners, whether it's suppliers, in this case, utility partners, other nations, and NGOs. Going back to that component around supply chain resilience, the Department of Defense has had for some time has been very concerned about supply chain integrity. So making sure that your components, your software, your key items in anything the department buys for the battlefield are made by trusted allies and partners. You've probably heard this discussion quite a bit in the context of critical minerals and batteries and China's sort of prominent position on those 2 items across the supply chain. So we've always, as the Department of Defense, has always been concerned about supply chain integrity. And what was very interesting, though, is it's just one step from climate change integrity to climate change resilience. Knowing where your goods and services are produced, manufactured, where they come from is critical in a world that is affected by climate change risk and by political instability. What was an interesting thing is we work with many of our top tier suppliers and found, in many ways, a clean supply chain is a resilient supply chain. So if you have a supply chain that has lower embedded greenhouse gas emissions in those scope 3 categories that Amanda talked about, you know where your products are being produced, and odds are they're being produced by a friendly power with a relatively clean national grid and not being transported 3 or 4 times across the Pacific for lots of value add in the production of a particular good and service. So I think I'll stop there with that statement. A clean supply chain is a strong supply chain, and I'll turn it over to Carla. And
thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And Ed and team, I appreciate everyone, including me, and inviting me to share in the discussion. What I think,
Carla, you're a little off center.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. Okay. And while I had you to stop, I just want to remind people to put your questions in the question box. And there's an exit survey that I would like you to take at the end. It pops up, and the video will be ready just a couple of hours after the session. So Carla, let me give it right back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. What I really liked from the first couple of speakers now has been the focus on the supply chain, which I think is key. Because as Stephen said, while this regulation does not apply right now to 98% of the other people, it eventually will. And it's really important that as the top tier contractors look at this requirement and think about how they're going to implement it within their organizations, they really think through all the way down to their supply chains. So they have a big job ahead of them. What I also like about this potential rule is the focus is on decarbonization. It's clearly on mitigating our climate impacts. And we hear from experts every day on how reaching that 1.5 goal and 2.0 Celsius goal is just around the corner. We're not going to stop global warming at the rate we need to unless we get serious about it. And this is one way to potentially do that. What's also significant about this is it provides the public statement by the government that it's great to look at adaptation. It's great to think about sustainability in purchasing and everywhere else. But we really need to think about, are there things we can do right now to mitigate our climate impact rather than just waiting for other technical solutions or future innovation? When I think about this potential rule, there's a couple issues that others have raised, one of which is the standard setting organization that looks at this is not a federal organization, and there's defense and national security risks that we'll talk about as a team. In addition, it's whether or not the federal acquisition regulation can provide this level of enforcement for these requirements on these other federal agencies. This new requirement, I believe, provides a national security advantage. And that advantage is to really allow these companies to dive deep into how they think about their mission, their value to their customers, what they make, what they produce, who they interact with. Looking at their climate disclosure helps them really think about what advantages they're giving to the taxpayer, but also how they can align their purchasing and other management requirements and operational requirements to be more climate friendly and climate conscious. What I like about the rule is the standardization that's going to be required for looking at the science-based risk assessments and the ability to provide guidance across functional areas for the whole of government. So I'm going to stop there and let us get into the questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carla, Richard, and all of you for so many thoughtful comments. And we could only talk for the next 3 hours just based on what you said. But let me go back and Miranda, back to you first. And Carla just referred to this very briefly. What are the benefits of collecting emission and other climate risk information from large contractors in a standardized format? What's the best way for procurement officers to distill this and how their contractors are managing climate risk, Miranda?
Great. Well, let me touch on a couple of things. So just very simply, It's an old adage, we've all heard it, but what you measure, you manage. And it's really important for organizations to be measuring two things. One, their own climate emissions. And that is important because as governments around the world regulate climate emissions, it's important for every organization to understand what their exposure is to those regulations. Second, it's also very important to be measuring the risks and opportunities to your business of the changing climate and changing weather patterns. So whether that is where tomatoes are going to grow most successfully for a Walmart store, or where we can mine iron ore successfully for building a fighter jet. All of these businesses will be impacted by changing weather patterns, whether it's drought, hurricanes, floods. And Richard mentioned the Department of Defense climate adaptation planning. And at the Air Force, we have found that every installation anywhere, everywhere in the world is going to be impacted by some form of changing weather, whether that's exposure to drought, heat, land degradation, coastal erosion, flooding along rivers. And we know that if that is happening to Air Force installations, it's happening to the suppliers who are building all of the critical materials that we need to protect our nation and maintain peace around the world. So being not just measuring greenhouse gas emissions, Steve, that is very important, and it's a great first step for that first tranche of suppliers in these FAR rules to begin measuring their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and that will help them understand their potential risk to future regulation. But that last little bit, that's just the very small percentage of the largest DoD suppliers, largest federal government suppliers, those companies who are also being asked to look at the risks to their businesses and the opportunities. We often forget to talk about the opportunities to our businesses to grow and thrive in the changing climate world. But that piece, in my view, is just as important as understanding and managing your own emissions. To your second question around how can a procurement officer begin to make sense of massive amounts of data? The good news is there is very strong consensus globally on how companies can measure their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions data for most industries, not all. There's still some complicating factors in some industries, and that is to use the greenhouse gas protocol. There's very extensive guidelines on how to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. There are lots of places to report that information once it has been measured. The CDP climate disclosure platform is probably one of the most well-known and most widely utilized. It was really founded, in fact, by the Ceres Investor Network on Climate Risk many, many, many years ago, and has become really the standard for where most climate disclosure happens. But procurement officers can gather and look at information in a number of places.
Well, that's very, very helpful. And your comment just about, there's information out there, there's a lot we can learn. And the reality is those largest companies, and many of our listeners probably already know this, they're probably already starting to do this because of the international regulations. There are new rules in Europe, CSRD. There are many other countries that are in various stages of adopting what's called the International Sustainability Standards Board. There's obviously the SEC rule that is now been passed, is going to litigation. There's the state of California that are all covering slightly different audiences, but large companies. And so there is probably most of these companies are either already doing or will be required soon. So in terms of that information, your other comment were all very helpful, particularly about every base is going to face this, and suppliers, just how the scope of the problem that we're all seeing. Let me go back with another question, and then I'm going to go to Richard afterwards, and then I'll come back to you. Hopefully there'll be time. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, you worked with Walmart to implement disclosure requirements aimed at mitigating climate risk for its supply chain. what are some of the best practices that the US government maybe already has learned or could learn from Walmart's success?
Well, in some ways, I've already shared some of it. First, you just need to ask. I think you were absolutely right in your opening remarks, Steve, that the FAR Commission was very smart in how they put these rules together, and that often for the largest consumers and buyers of things, it is actually a small percentage of the supply chain that make 80 or 90% of the things that are consumed. So really focusing on those companies who are the largest suppliers would be a place to start. Second, requesting that the supply chain use the standard formats. What can be challenging for suppliers if they have multiple customers, which most do, is getting different kinds of requests from different kinds of customers. So using the standards of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the CDP reporting platform, or whatever bespoke reporting platform an organization has is also very helpful. I would also say that it can be very helpful to offer assistance and support. As soon as these kinds of rules and regulations come out, very expensive consultants kind of come out of the woodwork, calling up all the suppliers saying, we can help you comply. And indeed, there is value to the offerings that many of the consulting world companies have to offer. And conducting a greenhouse gas emissions analysis doesn't need to be too hard and too complicated. And this is a well-known process now, using utility bills, using meters at your facilities. And there are ways that the large procuring agencies can offer support to suppliers so that they can get jump started on the path, and then hire the consultants for the really complicated things like mitigating their emissions or thinking more strategically about how changing weather patterns might force them to think about their business differently and where they operate differently, or how they build their buildings differently. I'll just give you one example. When I first entered the Pentagon, we were using historic 100-year data on weather patterns as we were making our building decisions. And that actually was written into law. We didn't have a lot of choice on what we could do, but we knew that we were making decisions based on weather patterns that were not going to be true in the future. So we began working with Congress, working with our sister agencies to start using climate-informed modeling to look ahead at how we were building facilities, how high we were building them, if they were on a coastline that we thought may erode, how weather resistant we might be building them, how far in from the coast we might be building them. Even small changes like whether you put your HVAC equipment in the basement or on the roof. If you happen to be in an area that has high wind and low flood risk, you might put it in the basement, not on the roof, and vice versa. High flood risk, low wind risk, you might put it on the roof, not in the basement. So those kinds of more sophisticated, complicated questions, that's where your supply chain really ought to be thinking about hiring professional support to help them be thinking about mitigation. But as large procurement agencies, we have the opportunity to help them with the earlier steps of the basic, how do I measure my greenhouse gas footprint? What is the greenhouse gas protocol? What are the other standards? Where do I report it?
Great. That's very, very helpful. And your examples are literally grounded from the air conditioning and some of the other assets. It's an issue that many industries are facing. I know the insurance industry is facing now. What models do they use? Because again, you can't predict what's going to happen in terms of climate change going forward by looking backwards. So there are more questions, but I'm going to move on to Richard. And Richard, really appreciate your thoughtful comments overall, but particularly when you said, clean supply chain is a strong supply chain. So as you know so well, and based on the leadership from you and others, the Biden administration sustainability plan calls for net zero emissions procurement by 2050, and the proposed rule calls for disclosure of science-based emission targets. I think that people would agree that emission reductions are part of the are important from an environmental perspective. How do emission reductions help protect the federal budget and taxpayers?
Right. So Stephen, thanks for that question. So there's a number of this rule. There's an executive order on the procurement of carbon-free electricity. There's a number of rules around the notion of harnessing the purchasing power of the federal government to either improve disclosure or to address some of the vulnerabilities. So at the macro level, the Department of Defense is already being affected by climate change. Right? On the global stage, events caused by a warming planet are leading to instability. And by that, we basically mean climate change is putting increased demands on states. And as these demands exceed the state capacity, adaptive capacity, then the state becomes sort of unstable, and you see a variety of things occurring. It could be in the span of a natural disaster, a hurricane or a typhoon, but you also see this in terms of migration, loss of cereal production, loss of access to protein, water, and other things. So at the global stage, climate change is putting demands on the Department of Defense. On the Department itself, Defense itself, as Miranda said, our installations, our people, our infrastructure, our being the Department of Defense, is already being adversely affected. And when I started in the Army, we had a $50 million annual reserve for weather events for our infrastructure. So between 2017 and 2021, the bill was about $12 billion for the Department of Defense. So you can't put $50 million into 12 billion, or correction, 12 billion into 50 million. Okay, it doesn't work that way. So that's an effect right here and now. And then the effects in terms of people and the ability to do the things that we ask of our service members in a hotter, more humid climate. So for the Department of Defense and for the country, I mean, the science is pretty clear. We have to, as a nation, get to sort of net zero carbon emissions by 2045 to avoid even worse effects, all right, or unmanageable effects. So the Department of Defense has a vested interest in reducing its own greenhouse gas emissions and helping to improve the persuasive stature of the United States on the global stage, and to, in fact, use that buying power to help incentivize production of technologies such as advanced geothermal, advanced nuclear, heat pumps, the whole range of technologies that are needed. So this summer, the Department of Defense published a greenhouse gas reduction plan. It has been provided to Congress. There's a lot of good news in that plan. There's some pretty clear pathways to net zero installations, pretty clear pathways to improving military capability while reducing greenhouse gases up to a point. All right, there is not right now a clear technological pathway to get the Department of Defense to net zero. All right, there simply is no at-scale substitution for liquid fuel in the quantities that are required for the Department of Defense to perform its mission. So that is a real challenge, and it's also a call for innovation for our partners and industry, venture capitalists, all those great innovators. And just a little bit on innovation, sort of in the clean energy technology race, I often say the country that wins the race to the clean energy future wins, period. All right. The challenge is China has already pretty much won the race on first generation nuclear technologies. And we're losing that race, or we've already lost it. It's too late. So the only way we're going to win is if we innovate into the next generation of technologies, clean energy technologies around the world. And that's what America does best. So we need to take stock and encourage that innovation ecosystem that does so much for the country. And the Department of Defense recently has done a number of things. There's the Office of Strategic Capital, there's the Defense Innovation Unit, a range of activities across the Department of Defense to help speed that up. Thank you.
That's so helpful, and you raised so many good points. Richard, how does this proposed rule help promote what you just say? How does it help promote innovation and other things that are needed for the Department of Defense and other agencies?
Well, so I think all agencies, or correction, all the suppliers, we're moving to a world where suppliers have to know their greenhouse gas emissions. There's no, if they want access to capital, if they want access to markets, if they want access to social license to continue to operate, companies have to know their greenhouse gas emissions, all right? And once they start to track and once they start to know them, once they start to collect metrics, as Miranda said, then they can manage them. And when you take a look at where some of your highest greenhouse gas emissions are in your supply chain, the results may surprise you. You can go after those first, all right? And then, as Miranda suggested, there's a number of great consulting organizations that can help you, an organization plan its investments. But go after the easy ones first, and save the bulk of your investment for the harder ones.
Great. And let me ask you, I know that the federal government's really taken some big leadership on geothermal. Maybe you can just briefly talk about that, and how is that an example of what the department is doing to lead the way?
Yeah, so thanks. So I'm going to push back just a little bit on Ed's initial comments. So while the Department of Defense is the largest purchaser, all right, we are often not a market leader. Okay, so the Department of Defense has 180,000 vehicles, second largest vehicle fleet in the federal government, and that's 0.01% of the number of vehicles sold in America. So we're probably not going to be able to move the market much. But where the federal government, particularly Department of Defense, can move the market is where they have a large market share. So a number of organizations have reported the Department of Defense's efforts around microgrids and large-scale battery storage represent about 30% of the market here in America. So these investments that DoD is making to build energy security are extremely important because they're going to drive the cost down for everyone. Inside those efforts, there's a recognition that you must have clean, baseload, carbon-free electricity, all right? So you have executive orders and you have rules, but you also have statute, and statute says our installations must be energy resilient. We also have to recognize the real world conditions that our adversaries, potential adversaries, state and non-state actors, will reach out and will attack our grids here in the United States to prevent our forces from deploying. So that's the reality. So you must have energy resilience. The department has set 14 days of energy resilience. They're building that through microgrids, renewables, battery storage, but candidly, right now, to get that resilience to meet the law, the statutory law requires a fossil fuel plant. All right. So if we want to change that dynamic, then there's a couple of technologies that have to be invested in. Long-term power storage, which the Department of Defense is doing with the Department of Energy, advanced nuclear power, which some work has begun and more should be done, perhaps hydrogen, but there's some questions about how to move and transport the hydrogen and produce it in the first place, and then advanced geothermal. So the Department of Defense now has 7 procurement activities underway for advanced geothermal projects across all 3 services. It's really exciting. You know, it's basically this combination of new technologies to create opportunities. It's a story of American innovation. So you look at hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing produces a couple of things: oil, gas, you know, some water byproducts, and data. And part of that data is where heat exists in the Earth's crust that we didn't know existed before. So what's happened is a number of American startup companies are saying, hey, we can take that data, we can find small pockets of heat, we can use horizontal drilling, another byproduct technology of fracking, and we can go to these small heat pockets that previously were ignored, and we can, on a 2-acre pad, we can produce 15 to 20 megawatts of perpetual carbon-free electricity. So you get 2 or 3 pads like that across an installation, you connect them to the microgrid, and now you have an installation that is 100% energy resilient and carbon-free. And oh, by the way, the Department of Defense is doing it first, and they're driving down the costs for everybody else in the country. So it's a good news story about innovation, about data, about the Department of Defense leading where it has a market share and can really make a difference.
That's great. Again, such a great example, and there's so much more there. Carla, I'm going to turn to you now. Again, I understand that you have built such strong relationships with large defense contractors over your career. Can you just share what you're hearing about the proposed rule, and what are you hearing about the importance of climate risk disclosure from leaders in the Defense Department? And does DoD engage, or how do they engage in regular conversations with suppliers? Love to get your thoughts on any or all of those points.
Sure, thank you. I do believe that contractors are really thinking through this whole notion of climate risk. Many of them are publicly traded. They have to report that to their shareholders, to their boards. So from a business perspective, they're looking at that. But also, again, as I said initially, this is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity for these large companies to collaborate within their own industries, as well as with their partners and subcontractors. As Richard mentioned, we work with our allies for lots of products, lots of various parts, and it's an opportunity to also collaborate with them. Everyone wants to meet this higher standard. And so there's a real initiative, I think, to think through improving communication. And once this rule is in effect and you start to write the guidance and the requirements, especially in the defense world, there's an opportunity to be very specific. I think the best thing that, or the thing that most industry wants, is a clear path. They are willing to invest in the compliance requirements. They're willing to invest in the people to explore how to meet these metrics and hopefully realize some cost savings. But having a structured framework and a way to roll this out so that communicating about what they're measuring, why it's correct, and how they're going to pass that on is really significant and important. What was your second question? Sorry.
It's what are you hearing about the importance from leaders in the Defense Department, and how do they engage? I think
They do engage quite often. Obviously, this is a rule in the making, so they're not talking about this specifically, but DoD consistently reaches out to industry. There's program managers throughout the department and all of the services that engage regularly with industry. There's major national conferences, and the industries themselves are some set industry standards. Some notion of industry standards is often a little bit looser. I work a lot in the utility industry, and while there's not one set industry standard for doing things, everyone who does utilities on the private side and then also sells to the government has a certain level of expertise in technology that they bring to solutions. And so within that framework, each company then has their own best practices. And I think what's going to be significant about this from a procurement perspective is helping the contracting community understand what the industry standards generally are, how to look for those unique qualifiers and best practices. And that's where I think the opportunity is also for the industry and the government to continue to have more direct and specific conversations. What are we talking about when we change how we do business? And how can we cultivate an environment of open sourcing, more technology, and moving more rapidly toward mitigation?
Absolutely, that makes sense. Just following up on the point you just said, will the large contractors, those over 50 million of sales to the government that have to do scope 3 in terms of their suppliers, what do you think they'll get from the reaction from their suppliers on this area? What do you see as coming from that?
Well, I think what the suppliers are going to want to know is how can they also look at these formatted structured ways of doing things. This is all data driven. So it's software, it's networking, it's systems, it's a way to share. They're going to have to start to share data. The suppliers are going to have to input data. There's a lot of cybersecurity requirements that we need to think through when this type of operation happens. And again, to meet compliance, it's again going to be all automated. And so in order to help their suppliers meet these requirements, it's really an opportunity for them to reach out and start working with them on how to meet these specific measurements.
Yeah, that's great. So there are a few other questions that have come in that I'm going to answer a little bit, but welcome anyone else to jump in. And then I'm going to come back to all of you for a summary comment in just a minute or so. It's good news that the FAR Council is using some of the standards that several of you have talked about before, from TCFD and Greenhouse Gas Protocol and others, because it's very much the worldwide standard. How does it avoid delegating too much responsibilities? And we think, again, it is great to use these. Thousands of companies use them. Many of the larger suppliers already do it. And we think that the federal government should, in the proposal that we have, is instead of just delegating to one of these entities, the entities could go through changes or things like that. They look at what's in their rules and then they adopt them as part of their own. That's what the SEC has done, for example, in their rule and other areas. And that way they can use, for example, science-based, market-based areas, but not go from there in terms of the other areas. One of the other questions came in is, and I'll see if whoever wants to answer this, do you envision the federal government helping the private sector build resilience to climate change? Could it identify best practices that suppliers could use to give them disclosure and share those best practices in the future? So I'll see if any of the three of you want to jump in on that. Miranda, Richard, Carla?
Well, I on some of the best practices that I've seen. So, obviously, first and foremost, measurement. Have to measure emissions and track against potential regulation, and then, of course, measuring and examining the risk to your operations. So that, that's what we're seeing in the private sector. I'll push back against Richard a little bit. I actually think that the Department of Defense does lead the private sector in many ways. They tend to be very humble, as Richard just was, and think that they don't lead. But there are some areas where I can tell you, having spent most of my career in the private sector, DoD certainly is far advanced of where the private sector is. So sharing knowledge through forums like my old organization, the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, to accelerate ability to engage in solutions is always a recommendation I have.
Great. Carl, did you want to add something before we move on?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So the SEC has finalized its rule, as you know, and the state of California has passed laws for climate disclosure. So one of the questions is, why are these still needed? And what can the administration do to alleviate supplier concerns about multiple and forms and compliance? Again, I'll kick this off but then I'll turn it over to anyone who wants to before we do a kind of a final wrap up. I think they're very synergistic with each other because they all use TCFD and GHG, greenhouse gas protocols, as a basis. That obviously we don't know what the final FAR Council rules will say, but that there's a lot of similarity, and we hope at some point there will be what's called substituted compliance, where by filling out one, it automatically covers you for the others. But again, that's a little bit down the road. Just to give context, when we talk about this 1.3% of the contractors, collectively, the rule will cover 86% of the annual spend and about the same percentage of the greenhouse gas impacts. So it makes an enormous impact on that piece of it. Let me turn this over maybe to Richard, Miranda, and then Carla for any either response to any of the comments that have been said or a final wrap up of anything else you want to, before I kind of summarize myself. Richard, first to you.
Hey, thanks. So I'll just rattle off a few quick things. One, the Department of Defense's Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are calculated every year and are publicly available. We're one of 2 militaries in the entire world that do that. Okay, so I will claim some leadership there. Back to Miranda, we set the mark, the United States, for military transparency. Also, the greenhouse gas emissions of the federal government's largest suppliers are posted thanks to GSA. And what's interesting, of course, is on that list, the largest of the large are for the most part defense firms. A little bit of a story. So, you know, when the Secretary of Defense or the Deputy Secretary of Defense, they meet with CEOs of companies and they get a big briefing book about the weapons system and all this. Well, we started to add a little tab in there about the environmental positions of the company, right? And do they have science-based targets? Do they have commitments to greenhouse gas reduction? Do they tie executive performance to environmental metrics? And certainly not a scientific study, but anecdotally, we basically drew a couple of conclusions. One is those companies that are exposed to the international marketplace, particularly Europe, have better policies in place than those that operate only in the United States. And those companies that have a diverse product line, which includes civilian gear or civilian equipment, are much more attuned to these issues than companies that are primarily and purely defense focused. So I think for the major defense contractors, there's a lot of room for improvement. Finally, you know, a lot of discussion about ESG and its ups and downs. And I was just last week in Texas where I got to hear from the financial officer of the state and talking about that state's position on ESG. Look, ESG is just information. The free market and the capital markets demand information, and that information is going to be collected and shared as long as people have free choice in where they make their investments. So ESG might be called something else somewhere down the road, but that information is critically important and will be collected. And for all actors in the market, the sooner we can fix on some standards, the better off we're going to be.
That's great. That's very helpful. Miranda, I'll ask you and Carla to keep it to 60 seconds, but that's great. No. Richard, thank you. And hearing about the military, one of only two, that's quite impressive on scope 1 and scope 2. Miranda, over to you.
Do you want us to answer the most recent question or just give our parting thoughts?
I give parting thoughts, but if you want to wrap in the question, feel free. Whatever you want to say in the next 60 seconds.
I'll thank everybody for joining. It's great to see such a large audience for this topic, which is such a very wonky topic. We would encourage you to get involved, learn more about this particular rule, provide support for seeing its passage this year, and learn more about the federal government's climate activities. Every couple of years, the federal government puts out the National Climate Risk Assessment. It is one of the only, if not the only, whole of government risk assessment, and it's absolutely fabulous. It was started under the George W. Bush administration and has continued under every administration since. Highly encourage you to read that, learn about the impacts to your communities, and learn about what your federal government agencies are doing, because we are the people's government. So learn, get engaged, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Carla, briefly.
Briefly, thank you. It's been really interesting learning about all of this, and I'd encourage all the suppliers to the larger companies to start talking to them and figure this out, because it's a fun process and there's a lot of progress to be made.
Great. Thank you all. Such pearls of wisdom. Ed, if you could join us by putting up the balance of the slides just as we run through again. We'll send this out, but hope you all get involved, as all of our speakers just said. Next slide. There's other things if you want to look at. We have an initiative, Freedom to Invest, in response to some of this anti-ESG initiatives. We'd love to engage you with that. freedomtoinvest.org. Next slide, please. If you're involved with a company that's in the learning curve on this, we have a course with the University of Michigan. They can learn more about these things. Next slide, please. We have, we're co-sponsoring an event. There are lots of interesting conversations in a few months in New York City. Hope you'll consider joining us for that. Next slide, please. We also have lots of other reports that are available. All of these are free. And next slide is, we have, again, a variety of events. And then next slide, I think there's just two more very quickly in terms of other events. Yeah, so hope that you'll join us. I want to end by, again, thanking Ed, thanking our distinguished speakers, thanking all of you for joining. And Ed, turn over to you for a wrap up. You're on mute, Ed.
But that's what, it's the 21st century, most stated sentence, you're on mute. But thank you all. It was really a great discussion. And I've been a contractor for 40 years, so I really kind of feel what this is like. And I just really support all the points that you've made. I think you just made incredible points. One thing we're doing at GW that I'll mention before I turn off is that we're looking at what we're seeing is the inverse relationship between carbon emissions and operational efficiency. So if you work on one, you reduce one, like carbon emissions, in a forensic way across the operation. There's a big bang for that, really overall. Please take the exit survey. There's a question about the FAR rule that we'd like to get your support with in terms of supporting that. The video will be ready shortly after this. Everyone automatically gets an email. I just thank the audience for sticking with us right to the end. And again, thank you for a wonderful discussion. And I certainly thank Ceres for co-hosting this and putting the production on. So thank you all. And with that, I'm going to end the session.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.